bunch of weird paranoid suspicions about what the hell was going on, because there was a lot of stuff I couldn't understand. And nobody was really bothering to explain it to me. And I formed a bunch of opinions about the town and about the people in it that were like, surely that couldn't be. And then you find out later on the track that you are exactly on track.
All right, I'm here with Angela Nagle. She is an investigator of the internet, a Jane Goodall of the web in a way. And she's written a best-selling book called Kill All Normies, among others. You can find her on Substack to check out her newsletter, where she's writing a variety of topics, in particular some about Ireland. And I'd like to welcome her, and if you could please elaborate a little bit more about your biography.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I guess, yeah, the early stuff that I wrote about was sort of about politics, I guess. And then the book was about kind of internet culture and sort of rival factions of radicalizing forums and things like that. And since then, I'm sort of a little bit politically homeless, so I've ended up on Substack. I think the very first week that I was on it, I wrote about something you had written, which is how we ended up in touch. But I think what interested me in what you had written is that it seemed to me for many years that ideas that are seen as kind of old-fashioned and maybe even failed to some degree in Ireland, like national economic development ideas, are going to have to be embraced again at some point, because I do think that the current model of just basing the entire economy on low corporation tax is unsustainable, in part because I think bigger nations and bigger geopolitical forces will just probably not allow it at a certain point.
Yeah, I very much agree. I think that while the temptation of kind of foreign-led development, as Ireland has taken upon itself, is attractive, no one really argues that the Celtic Tiger did not have benefits. But the key aspect is, well, what are the relative benefits and what are the relative costs, and is this sustainable? And so ultimately that was shown with the financial crisis, that all of a sudden everything can kind of be turned off, and you enter into this phase of austerity, which completely downgrades in terms of public investment, private investment to public sector employment, and all services that sort of make up the nation and everything that the nation provides to service the economy. So like you said too, there's this kind of coming inflection point where Ireland really needs to kind of see what the future holds for it, as you can't just rely on the low tax regime any longer if America goes into a new global standard of getting rid of that. So with that being said, you have to turn to maybe old ideas that seem outdated, but where I've been coming from is trying to understand Irish economics, Irish history through this sort of heterodox lens. And that's where, finding some of your material, it was refreshing to finally see, okay, I'm not alone out there. There's someone else that is picking up this current. And so I'd like to ask, why do you think there is such opposition to some of these heterodox ideas in Ireland?
I suppose Ireland was really, it's a very new nation in terms of like the nation state, and its independence is not even 100 years old. And so I think that its development process, it had this structural kind of underdevelopment that was part of being essentially an agricultural supplier for the British Empire. And so then it had to pretty much build like national infrastructure from scratch in many ways. And there's basic stuff like plumbing, but even energy and things like that. It had to do all that very quickly from scratch. And while it was just getting on its feet, there was a few sort of like roadblocks along the way to maybe doing that as quickly or successfully as they would have liked. And then suddenly the 90s sort of happens and all these like ideas just become extremely fashionable with the rise of, tell me if this is the wrong timeline, but this is what it always seemed like to me. In the 90s, there was this kind of Blair and Clinton moment and everyone was talking about the new economy and this idea that you could basically just pass that phase of development. And so, this was like very attractive to these sort of tech people who came from often like back to the land kind of like subcultures in the 70s and stuff like that. So they had all these ideas about basically, a kind of a green post-industrialism, that you could even like go to the third world and just like tell them skip, you don't need to build dams and all these things. You can just go straight to these kind of like appropriate technologies and just digital. And so basically those ideas became fashionable in the 90s and Ireland opened up its economy to this low corporation tax regime. And they essentially, I think, didn't really appreciate how good they had it in many ways. And this is like the universal boomer kind of narrative, but it's very true in Ireland's case. Just to give an anecdotal example, my parents, neither of them finished school, right? But they both got an amazing education. They learned Latin and all these things, like way better educated than anyone of my generation. They did an exam and got into the civil service where they worked in the GPO in Dublin. They had really good pay. They had a great pension. They were able to buy a house when they were still in their 20s in Dublin. Our generation couldn't even imagine this, right? And they hadn't even finished school. Every one of my mother's brothers were employed by a national employer like the ESB or Éireann Road Éireann or something like that. And they all, again, these are working class jobs, really good pay, really good pensions, everything. And yeah, as I say, I mean, more fashionable ideas were around and they just kind of didn't think that this was having as many benefits as they would like quickly enough or something like that. My grandfather was also employed working in the building of a hydroelectric power station, and so all of these things were actually working really well and managed to develop the economy very quickly. And in many cases, there are so many aspects of what they were doing then that I think we will return to when we kind of see the wisdom of, in many ways, if or when this current kind of fashionable idea starts falling apart. And so, yeah, I think that was the general. So to me, it's sort of like I was saying to you before we started, I'm not an economist at all. But I just think that it seemed to me that these kind of bigger ideas about nationhood and progress and all these kinds of things are tied up in these ideas,
Yeah, and I think so much has to do with basically this, all of Irish history, but this crucial 100 years timeline of why the thinking is what it is today. And it has to do with basically this sequence of events concerning the revolution, the chaos that ensued afterwards, this sort of embracement of, hey, we need some stability, the sort of return of at least rhetoric nationalism with De Valera, and the economics that went along with that, at least again, rhetorically.
Yeah.
And then that was really the crucial inflection point in the mid 20th century, where everyone said, okay, well, we're starting to get around to the opinion that this is the wrong direction. There is stagnation. People are still immigrating. We need to try something different. Then we have the Whitaker Revolution. We start bringing in foreign capital. You keep going and going and revving that engine. And then finally you get to the 90s where everything's kind of exponential. And then you have sort of the subsequent rug pulling out under it in the late 2000s. Yeah. So this is all coming together to basically show that nationalism, or again, that's a loaded term, but like economics that prioritizes the national well-being is poo-pooed and distrusted because of these crucial sequence of events. And that's where I'm hoping to kind of articulate, well, why is that the case? And is it potentially wrong? So I'd like to ask too, how is that current opinion of the De Valera era still fueling opinions about, oh, well, we can't possibly, turn our backs on Google and, all these foreign multinationals?
Well, maybe it's, I sort of cringe a little bit sometimes when people invoke like historical memory kind of things like this that are just impossible to prove. But I do think there is genuinely a sense that Irish people have that they're very much at the mercy of international forces, and that anything could go wrong kind of at any time, So they're actually pretty cautious in many ways, conservative in the sense of cautious, because they don't really want to rock the boat a lot of the time. And, it's not that hard to see why, because, we had like a huge famine and all these things historically where, we just, the bigger international forces, that can, if they turn against you, right, and you're this like tiny island, basically nation, things can go very badly. So, Ireland is I think it's not just the political class. I mean, there are always like rebellious like figures in politics as well, but I think it might be just a general national feeling at the moment anyway, that, we don't want to annoy the EU. We don't want to annoy anyone in Google. We don't want, and so we just like adopt whatever they tell us to, and even sometimes go further than any other country in total obedience to whatever the rules are. And so there is a lot of that. I think that's just the general, like I think if you're Britain or something like that, you can assert yourself, and that you will at least survive as a nation. You're a big enough player in the world. Whereas Irish people, I think, do have a sense, which is not entirely wrong. There is always, you are taking a gamble that if they assert themselves nationally in that kind of way, that they'll be punished and that terrible things will happen as a consequence. Poverty and economic isolation and things like that. So there is a general lack of confidence there. Now, I do think that, having said that, I definitely think that the kind of stuff that critics of this type of economics, maybe 10 years ago, or certainly before 2008, before the financial crisis, critics of it back then were always just totally dismissed. And I do notice from observing general discussions that that's not the case anymore. People do see that, you can't really just be a parking lot for these companies, like, and you will lose all of your meaningful sovereignty. You're not going to be able to control anything about your economy or your culture or your values or your destiny or any of these things, and even having such concepts is sort of against the worldview, because it's seen as nationalistic and therefore reactionary and stuck in the past and right wing and so on.
Yeah. And I get what you're saying about trying to kind of speculate how much historic memory is factoring into a lot of these decisions. But in many ways, it provides a lot of insights to discover, what could have been an alternative path, or like, what are these tangent threads that kind of survive of, alternative path. And that's where I really go back to the revolution and really what was the vision for the economic future of Ireland from those, leaders. And I stem this primarily from Arthur Griffith and Michael Collins. And what I find very frustrating is that they're often treated as kind of marginalized, almost like in America, we have, certain elite factions that talk about how hick certain ideas are, and they're provincial, they don't really derive from anything, they're just sort of this attitude. And that seems to be a way a lot of the academics and how mainstream opinion treats at least the economics of these guys, which then they view as basically coming into action with De Valera. Now, where I would argue is that they actually did write things down, which, as far as my knowledge of going over the existing literature, no one's really analyzed it to any sufficient degree of going through and saying, well, where are they deriving these economics? Are they citing anybody? Are they having kind of coherent policies and laying out step by step what they want to do? And, both of them do this quite eloquently and derive from a global source, Frederick List, the kind of premier development economist, who is very much considered to be the father of any country that is successfully developed by employing nationalist policies that say we need to prioritize our own industry, and specifically our own industry that is increasing returns to scale and increasing productivity, not just, hey, we can develop through agriculture, which is not the case. And so when you look across the board, the left or the right of the ideological spectrum, geographic wise, Asia, Europe, Latin America, any country that really starts to employ those policies, they start to lift off and move up the value chain. Unfortunately, all those theories that Griffith and Collins did elaborate on, you could maybe chalk it up to them, unfortunately, passing away both in 1922. But that legacy was basically handicapped because of the chaos of the revolution, the immediate civil war, and the ensuing inflationary events that were happening all around Europe at the time. And so ultimately the Irish chose, or at least those within the political establishment after the revolution chose that, hey, we need to sort of not experiment, and we need to just back the existing British aligned establishment when it comes to banking, when it comes to civil service. And that basically has, lasted 100 years going forward. It's this same idea that they were having in, let's say, 1927, of what is Ireland's economic future, what is Ireland's potential, what is the capacity, all these ideas, how fearful are you of the outside world, and as you say, punishment. All of those ideas existed right then there, and you can see a direct line connecting all the way to today. So ultimately, to kind of fix maybe some of these ideological plaque that builds up, you have to go back and actually correct the record of what actually happened back then.
Yeah, that's so interesting. It's funny because I hadn't really thought of List until I read your thing. I hadn't really thought of List as the, because I had always looked at De Valera as the example, and even then, I mean, it is undoubtedly true that, the best people were killed in the revolution, unfortunately. And it's funny too, because when I was younger, when I was a teenager, I guess, and maybe early 20s, I was like sort of anti-nationalist in many ways. Like I didn't like I didn't like the way in which those who died in the revolution were treated like, Jesus or something, like, you know, or like maybe Santa Claus would be a better example, right? Like these people are watching down on you and they sacrificed for us, and then, like, you know, they're seeing your, like, if you fail in some way, like on a national level, like you're like disappointing their memory and that kind of thing. Like that's always the way they were talked about. And but now that I'm a bit older and I actually go and read like the things that they wrote and how incredibly sophisticated they were. They're just like light years ahead of anyone that's around now on the political scene. And they actually understood all of these things very well. They had a really sophisticated, you know, idea of how to actually implement the things they wanted. And that kind of Listian economics is a good example. But you know, on so many other things too. I mean, the fact that the fact that they were so sophisticated on economics, and they had like, well, they basically like ran a guerrilla war in Dublin, and they had like an entire cultural movement which had, you know, like theaters and all these great writers and everything like that. I mean, it's almost unimaginable that such, you know, like really giants among men could really even exist now in a way. But I suppose we can at least go back and just dig up the things that they actually said, you know, rather than like reinventing the wheel in some ways.
Yeah, and I look at it from the perspective of, even though this might be changing, and there's probably people that still hold grudges about it, but it seems like the unanimous opinion is that the revolution was a good thing, and that,
Yeah.
you know, getting out of colonial control by England was a good thing. So
Yeah.
if you go back to the guys that had that great idea and you actually analyze, okay, what other things did they say? If the political aspect of the revolution is basically unvarnished, maybe those economics are also, you know, pretty good to consider. And that's where I tend to think, while there was a political revolution in Ireland, there was no economic revolution. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, you keep going into it and you see, you know, oh, are these maybe outdated ideas, or, you know, maybe it's useful, but maybe it doesn't really apply. But this is where I say, like, some vestiges like continued on past their death, just because of the milieu of the revolutionaries that were still able to attain power. And so that's where, amazing, I still get shocked by it. The Shannon hydroelectric facility.
Yeah.
Basically was not exactly the brainchild, but was inspired by all these ideas by Griffith and Collins. That legacy was continued on to actually do this. And it was around the same type of debate of, well, what's Ireland's capacity? What can it really do? And it was hampered by this idea of, hey, you might be free of England, but you still need to import tons of English coal to power all your electricity needs. And that was what was occurring. And Michael Collins was the first guy to articulate, hey, maybe we can do something differently. Maybe we shouldn't be reliant on our former enemies, you know, and, you know, again, relationships complicated, but we should probably try to be self-sufficient. And so that was carried on. And then by, you know, the 30s and 40s, when this is fully operational, almost 100%, and that's not like just a hyperbole I'm making up, almost 100% of Ireland's electricity demand was met by hydroelectricity.
Yeah.
And that's amazing. And the fact that that's not talked about more, now demand shoots up, and then basically you have to start bringing in other fuels to kind of meet that, you know, in the second half of the 20th century. But the idea that we're sort of, you know, one of the current debates is talking about, you know, energy and especially renewable energy. And Ireland, you know, back when everyone thought it had no sort of sophistication, basically proved the world wrong in so many ways, and was almost completely 100% renewable energy, and something that is worth digging into more to see that they had further plans of like expanding decentralized hydro, basically these sort of smaller plants that operated on the rivers and different lakes that you didn't need a big facility to actually power the whole country.
Yeah, I also liked, you mentioned that Griffith talked about having industrial development in general sort of like spread throughout the country rather than just concentrated in Dublin. And you know, there is a little bit of that. For a while, that was kind of the policy. Like there was some effort to do that, but you know, because otherwise you end up like in a situation where I guess like Britain would be an example where the entire country just gets sucked into London, you know, and then everywhere else just rots basically. And so, you know, that again, like would have been such a brilliant thing. And so many towns, you know, are kind of like falling into this problem where just like they simply can't keep any young people there. So they kind of just fall apart. But I also thought, you know, there's another power station, which is the one that my grandfather worked on, which is, it's in Wicklow, and it's called, God, I always forget the name of it, but it's not Ardnacrusha, it's a different one, but it's also a hydroelectric power station. And it's one where they like drilled a huge hole through this mountain, which you can still go through. They actually opened it up to the public to see. And it's not only an amazing piece of engineering, but it's actually so beautiful to look at. You know, it's not ugly at all, and it's, you know, renewable and everything. So again, like today, you know, anyone looking at, you know, the ideas that are sort of becoming fashionable once again, I suppose, would be so impressed by just looking at this achievement, you know.
Yeah, and to that achievement, at the time when they were building the Shannon plant they started like in the 20s, I guess, and then yeah, by 1931, it started to generate 96% of the total national generation. So that's the exact figure, and it was up until the Hoover Dam the world's most advanced and biggest hydro plant. So that's a nation which is, you know, maligned as, you know, basically third worldist, as, you know, tons of baggage coming from the English perspective on who the Irish were and what their potential was, that all of a sudden they were able to do this. And that's where I find maybe even this is my central thesis. There's a quote from the Financial Times of the era that said, the Irish were the shrewdest of psychologists. They have thrown their shoulders no easy task of breaking what is in reality an enormous inferiority complex. And the Shannon scheme is one and probably the most vital of their methods of doing it.
Yeah, no, that's true. And can I ask, because this is something that, like, obviously you were studying in Ireland, right?
Not technically in Ireland location, but I am, yes, I am at UCD.
Okay. Because I think that there is definitely an opening for these ideas to return among, like, not total outsiders, you know, but people who at least have the ear of people who have some kind of like power. And so I guess, what do you have any sense like of the possibilities going forward? Like what kind of, is there anybody in the Irish government that, or in Irish politics that you think could embrace these ideas, or is there anything that, you know, one could advocate for, I guess?
Yeah, as an American, I have sometimes trouble really understanding the nuances of Irish politics. I have come to understand, though, that you know, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil are basically two sides of the same coin, and you can't count on them for much. And even though Fianna Fáil has this kind of aura around them as the working class party, you know, they were the ones that did some of the heavy lifting when it comes to the Celtic Tiger and sort of all the multinational embracement. So I would say it's hard to find solace in them. Now you have the obvious, kind of third-party conjecture from Sinn Féin. They're riding on the coattails of, the youth housing crisis, and it seems like that is largely the reason why they got their unprecedented votes.
Yeah.
Also riding on the backs of the demographic shift in the North and sort of the, I guess, appeasement in some way of the reunification debate, where it's maybe less controversial to the young generation. So, I mean, Sinn Féin represents a vital force that's coming into Irish politics that is trying to stumble their way into, oppositional narratives to Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. And so, when you look at some of their economic documents, they definitely give lip service to industrialization, to try to kind of distance themselves from just being a tax haven. I would say it's not as thoroughly thought out. I would say it's sort of, again, it's almost sort of trying to embrace the rhetoric, similar to what maybe like De Valera did in his day, of this sounds good, national sovereignty sounds good, or whether it's right or left populism, it's like we're giving power back to the people. We're going to prioritize our own people's jobs. And so that's really where I see them going. And as far as any other political power coming to the fore, I don't see they have too much of a chance. But this is where I think, regardless of what the party is, I think there's probably real anger, as you would probably agree, of the crisis, the austerity, and this sort of dissonance between what the elite establishment is and what sort of the ordinary population of Ireland is.
Yeah, I mean, the main thing is just the incredible frustration of their inability to solve kind of very basic problems. Like the rent crisis, for example, has been going on so long. I can't even bring myself to be annoyed by it anymore, because I can't even like give any more like mental energy to being annoyed about it, because it's been going on for as long as I can remember. Really, I mean, so in 2008, I would say probably more than half of my friends and the people I knew left the country, and basically the economy has never really been the same since. But the rent crisis just goes on and on and on and on, and nobody ever seems to be able to do anything about it. We keep being told it's just so complicated that it simply can't be solved, which is just not, I just don't believe that. I mean, as I say, I'm not an economist, but like plenty of other countries have solved it. That's not possible. And so it's mainly for me just like this endless frustration that nobody seems to have any vision. Nobody seems to be able to solve anything. They, will, and the fact of the real lesson of 2008 was that it's not that they just are being just cautious. You know what I mean? It's not that they're just being, conservative about these things. They're willing to do crazy stuff when very powerful people need it to be done. You know what I mean? They're willing to try, things that are going to get them kicked out of government, and, this enormous bailout that they did. They're willing to do all kinds of stuff and bring in all kinds of measures when they really need to. So it's not just a question of like, they don't have any imagination or something like that. They just don't, it just seems like they don't have any desire to really serve the Irish public, and that they instead are constantly looking out to other bigger forces in the world to appease them and to always serve the most powerful people. And that's the main frustration, and it's just like, it feels like nothing ever changes. So I really welcome the Sinn Féin success. I think that, I like them, and I think that at the very least, if the other parties want to complain about, they even occasionally write really stupid things about them, trying to link them to populism more broadly in the world so that they can tar them with it and so on. Which of course, the one thing that they should know about that is that it will just make them more popular, right? If they're seen as being enemies of the media and so on. But I also think it will shake up the other parties. It will make, my only response to them would, when they start crying if Sinn Féin wins, is just to say, well, they are successful because they have actually attempted to do something about this decade-long rent crisis. And maybe you should consider doing that yourself, maybe you should come up with a better idea, but yeah, they just like, and I also am frustrated with, again, some people say, like, to go back to the boomer thing, like you shouldn't have like intergenerational conflict along these lines or whatever, but it is frustrating that there is a generation of people in Ireland who were absolutely the luckiest people imaginable, because they grew up with all these benefits of some kind of national economics. Like they grew up with, they have these great pensions and they had these amazing jobs, and they could afford housing and they had a great standard of living, really. And then they also benefited from the Celtic Tiger. And many of them were able, like their properties doubled in value or something, that kind of thing. And those people, a lot of the time, just like they really just have no sympathy whatsoever with the fact that everyone younger than them is screwed, and in many cases, I've had conversations with people of that age group, and I say to them, like, do you think it's right that you own like 2 or 3 properties, and your children, like your children's generation will go into their 40s, often with two incomes, not being able to afford one? Like, do you think that's fair? And they're just incredibly selfish about it. Their attitude is sort of like, well, we worked hard and we didn't have all the opportunities you have, right? Because they think, well, younger people have all this education, so they're the lucky ones. But what do you do if you have a PhD and you have no economic future whatsoever, So I think that's sort of how they, that's how they resolve it with their conscience or whatever, right? Like, young people are lucky because they have education. We didn't get that, but they don't realize that they were the right age at the right time, at this kind of sweet spot of history where they got the benefits of the old system and the new system at the same time. And that's probably not going to be repeated. So I think sometimes these parties play to those people a little bit, and they think, well, these young people, they can just leave, if they can't, if they need all these things from us, they can just emigrate, right? They speak English, they are educated.
Yeah, which is, startling to me coming in, as an outsider and, as a descendant of people.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what's the Irish connection? Is it recent or is it famine era?
Well, actually, like the period I'm studying. So all my family came over in like the 1920s, like
Right.
1910s, 1920s. And, Irish Americans, we have this very plastic relationship, as Irish nationals often like to deride, with our Irish heritage. And, but I always look at that as sort of almost, globalist or something, like, sort of like, you're not respecting my culture in a way.
Yes, yeah, this is such a funny thing.
East Coast Irish Catholicism is a distinct sort of ethnic group and has a very unique and detailed history all to its own.
Yeah.
And the connections that go back and forth really were staples up until like a certain point where that broke. And so my kind of decision to kind of embrace, these Irish studies came from my just family connection of kind of wanting to solve like, what is the history here and sort of why did this happen? And, why did they have to immigrate? And partly too, because, my professional background is looking at cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin and, sort of decentralized finance and also kind of revolutionary finance or financing revolutions against, an oppressive power. So my first task was to look at the way these things come together is the Dale loan in America, where it raised $6 million or £6 million at those prices in that era, which would be equivalent to like almost, 80 million pounds today. So this was so basically much of the revolution, like the entire impetus for Irish, national citizenship was largely funded by Irish Americans, which is like a startling thing to kind of think about. And how much this connection was really pressed upon when, De Valera and Harry Boland, notably, they were the ones that came over and really were the propagandists of going in, doing speeches, going all over the country too, going to every single Irish American community. And not just that, going to every sort of marginalized ethnic group community as well. Famously, Eamon de Valera is wearing a Native American tribal hat and, commenting on the similarities between sort of, the oppressive nature of each of their situations. I come to it from that perspective of wanting to see, how did they basically create the Bitcoin of their day and sort of subverting English control of the finances? And this what led me to these rabbit holes of, hey, there was a lot more, economics going on that was much more interesting than maybe just the transactions going back and forth.
That's so interesting. And I also think, I'm actually really annoyed increasingly by that whole plastic patty idea, because as we were discussing recently, the David McWilliams' whole like vision of the the kind of drawing on the diaspora. I mean, it is actually a vast diaspora. I mean, there's Irish people everywhere in the world, and also Irish people spread out at a time when they were incredibly fertile. So they just had, they multiplied everywhere. And so that's an enormous source of power to draw on, and those figures in history knew that, right? And that's why they did that. So I don't know. I would love to even see. I have a slightly conspiratorial mind these days because everyone does, I suppose, now. But I'd love to see where this idea was planted. That you just can't have any solidarity with the diaspora. Like that doesn't. I don't know why anyone would think such a thing. It's kind of a weird idea in a way.
Yeah, especially in the kind of modern era, as we're sort of seeing parallels with, let's say, it's very much the case that you can talk about these things when it comes to other countries immigrating to Europe, and you have the conception of sort of the third generation, fourth generation Muslim in a European context, where suddenly they feel that the pulls that brought their grandparents, parents' generation into the country no longer like attract them. They're in terms of employment or moving up the economic ladder. There's something going on where that no longer holds any gravity, and they're feeling more and more alienated from the host culture that they operate in as sort of, maybe alienated, and they kind of seek, going back into their heritage as to trying to find some identity and some solidarity. And in a way, like I could psychoanalyze myself, but like in a way, that's what many immigrant diaspora communities within America also are maybe interacting with, this idea of, when my grandparents and my parents got here, we existed in, essentially ethnic ghettos where we had our church that ran everything, where we had, everybody knew one another. There was cousins across the sea. There was very much a a closeness to the heritage. And now, you know, especially after World War II, Fordism, you know, suburbia, the construction of American identity as such, you know, that's all gone away. And so you're now like, we're some of the first generations actually having to deal with sort of this loss of connection to identity and heritage. So yeah, so that's where I see where the diaspora comes in, because like it was a question that was bound to be asked at some point by a generation of people that see themselves as unique in terms of their history, in terms of their relationship to power structures. I mean, the Irish versus WASP, you know, American debate has existed for a long time. And this was the, you know, one of the crucial presidents of America was an Irish Catholic who in many ways was oppositional to WASP establishment thinking. So yeah, so
it's even interesting to see kind of within like American nationalism, the Irish, there's an awful lot of Irish American figures in kind of like paleo-conservatism, sort of more anti-war isolationist type of conservatism, like Pat Buchanan and people like that. And yeah, the WASP tension is actually significant. It's not just a it's not just a sort of a recently invented thing. I know that what is his name? Eric Kaufman, you know him?
He's an academic, right?
Yeah, that's right. He's American. He's based in London right now, and I know that he wrote a whole book about this, and it's meant to be great. And he even goes into like the different groups that came from Britain and the sort of like why they followed completely different historical paths, like when they arrived, based on even names and things like that, like Smith and so on. And so yeah, that's meant to be really great. But yeah, I do notice even since I came back to so I was born actually in America. I don't know if I ever mentioned that. I was born in America. My parents are Irish, and they immigrated, I think, in the 70s or something. They moved back home when I was 7. So I spent my whole life in Ireland, but I came back to America I think it was the very end of 2017. And so I've sort of become much more aware of, like, I've noticed like people becoming more aware of identity and the sort of like these even differences like between that they may not have noticed before. So, you know, the difference between like I would even notice like a person's surname, you know what I mean, in a way that I never would have before. And it's just inevitable, I suppose, given exactly what you say, a generation of being totally suburbanized, you know, then creates this alienation, and people, you know, start to search for those identities. And also, like, people are conscious of the fact that, you know, and as I say, I would never have been aware of this before at all. Even something like, you know, when I was writing, and I got a lot of negative like feedback or whatever. I got a lot of pushback for things I was writing at the peak of sort of just canceling and all that kind of stuff. I didn't notice, somebody else pointed it out to me, but now I notice it all the time, which is that lots of the people defending me had these Irish surnames. Even if they were like multi-generations removed and living in America or Australia or somewhere else. Like, yeah, there's definitely that stuff is still going on, even if it's unconscious.
Yeah, and you know, in one sense, you know, you can have the argument that, you know, what are you doing? You're American. Like, what do you know about Irish culture? Or, you know, you have your own interests. Yada, yada, yada. But I think, you know, it really discounts the lived experience of what many people go through. And, you know, from my own personal take is that very much Irishism, Irish as an ideology almost,
Yeah.
was part of the experience, especially I know of, East Coast America. That exists. I mean, one of the things that's kind of funny as like an interlude is, many of the best, sports or even academic high schools in America, like let's say just the East Coast, because that's what I'm most familiar with, are Catholic schools. And like that's derived from, this Irish, mostly Irish, the Italians came too to help out, but this mostly Irish movement that started to kind of create their own schools. And the reason they're so good in sports and academics is because they're not regionally bound. And so they can cherry pick everybody from basically like an hour radius. So basically everyone ends up going there in order to kind of get the best team versus you're constrained to a closer locality. And so like, this is where these factors, these sort of trends of ethnic composition, of history, of cultural affinity, like they're still to this day just affecting culture and like how, America is formulating itself in a very, innocuous way.
Yeah, I mean, the actual creation of institutions, is so significant because I see something that completely took me by surprise when I first came to America as an adult, which is the rise of Catholicism, or the people embracing Catholicism who maybe were secular their whole lives and had come from secular families in many cases. Like often, just anecdotally, when I speak to people, many of them are converts, but some of them also are just people who are just kind of deracinated, and who came from very liberal kind of morally like permissive or whatever parents. And so they're all embracing Catholicism. But the thing is, they have institutions to go to. If you're outside of, it's one of the few places that you can actually go and have institutions and also have elite institutions, if you're not like, if you're not liberal, or if you're not like fully on board with like the new kind of whatever ideology that no one has a name for, you can go and you can actually have an institution, you can have publications, you can have, as a writer, for example, you have publications, you have a milieu, you have people backing you up. If, the New York Times or whatever, maybe that's a bad example, some publications are not going to publish you, well, that doesn't matter because you have these other ones. And you have this other world that you can exist in. That's hugely important, and not many people have that actually. And I also think that what's so interesting to me, and I really want to do something like, I was thinking of maybe even trying to do like a radio documentary type of thing on this, and just like interview tons of people, because I don't even have a clue what the answer is. So I would have to just talk to people to even start trying to answer the question. What I think is so interesting is the total seeming disappearance of Protestantism as a force in America, and the massive growing power of Catholicism among really smart people and often very elite people. And, to the point where if you see a really smart writer out there who's Protestant, like say a Peter Hitchens, for example, he has to write for a Catholic journal, because where else would, I can't think of the equivalent. I can't think of the Protestant equivalent of First Things, we'll say, so there's just, I don't see, unless I'm missing it or something, I don't see that they have any equivalent of these things. Even though there's the WASP thing or whatever, that's almost racial, like that's ethnic. It's not actually a religion. It's not as, the ethnic and the religious are not as fused in that way as you have with Catholicism in Italy or Ireland or any of these places. And so, and then I suppose also you had all this kind of, all of these breakaway factions of Protestantism, many of which became kind of almost like the basis for really mean caricature of like Hicks and, you know what I mean, low status things. For years, they became like the butt of every joke, like sort of rural, like I don't even know what like sect they would be, like Baptist. I don't know.
Evangelical.
Yeah, so I don't know. Do you have any theories on this, like why this happened, or why there's just no, as I say, there's no, if a Peter Hitchens wants to write for a highbrow Protestant journal, it doesn't exist.
Yeah, well, if, you can again look at these as like compartmentalized, and you have New England Protestantism, which you're sort of more so, I think, talking about when you talk about sort of a decline. It's sort of like this idea of the Brahmins of Boston, these sort of stalwarts of Protestantism that upheld it. They're no longer really with us. The only surviving Protestant strains are these diluted versions, or the very engaged versions, which are, you might call, lowbrow in the Midwest and in the sort of broader evangelical tent. Whereas with Catholics, again, we have a very, I think, interesting relationship, because I do think there's much more of an ethnic component than just like religious dogma going on. I think that there always existed this, I mean, the primary ethnic conflict in America, aside from the obvious, is really Irish versus WASP. And then, because they were the first huge ethnic group to really come into the country after the famine, Italians followed, other Europeans followed. The Polish Italians helped build a Catholic ethnic grouping, but it was really led by the Irish in this sort of dual conflict with the WASP. And so when you look at it that way, you see, like, is this really something about someone's argument over, the sanctity of like how you accept communion is really what's driving, all the political debates downstream? Or is this really sort of a historic animosity between what is seen as two separate groups, two separate classes of people? And that's where, too, like, even going to like evangelicals and Catholics would seem to be like in a somewhat union. Like, you have populist Catholics in America, you have populist evangelicals that embrace sort of social conservatism or this or that, big tent ideology. But again, from my experience as an Irish Catholic in America on the East Coast, I look at the evangelicals out there, not to disparage anybody, but as alien. I think like it's very kooky and it's very weird, and I don't understand how they embrace Christianity and how that all functions. Like I said, the way I kind of viewed Catholicism is very institutional. It was a place. It was a place everyone met to like discuss what's the weekly thing going on in the town. That's where all the kids played sports. That's where everyone got married. You threw parties in the church, community center. All the schools were. It's like these aren't about, like, no one cared about certain religious issues. I mean, I'm painting with a broad brush, but I'm like, that is the fundamental aspect of East Coast Catholicism, in the fact that it was an institution, whereas some of these more evangelical Protestantisms represent, ideologies where people believe things. And you see this with, let's say like Christian Zionism, like this is fueled not from an institutional framework, but from a specific dogma of beliefs and how you want to enact those beliefs in the world, where there's no comparison with Irish Catholicism.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And is there, in terms of how like the different factions of American Protestantism break down, is there an ethnic correlation? Like, did different national groups tend towards certain factions?
Yeah, so I mean, I believe there's a book out there, I forget the author, but he talks about there's really like maybe 12 or 13 Americas, and he kind of regionalizes it into things like sort of migration trends of, who went where, like very interestingly, like Germans make up a huge percentage of the Midwest, like kind of farming communities that came from, similar circumstances in Germany. And then like Swedish and like Finnish and Norwegians like congregate in sort of the Great Lakes, Minnesota, kind of cold tundra environment. So it's funny to see like how these regionals breakdowns occur. But when it comes to more like this religious dimension, you have very much the old stock Catholics being predominantly Irish, Italian, Polish, and then kind of going down the list of, you have Hungarians, you have, you have Latin Americans coming in more recently, some Asian from the Philippines more recently. And so you start to have that makeup. And then when it comes to Protestantism, you have the New England WASP culture of that brand. When you get to the Midwest, you have a lot of English that went out there that retained that Protestantism. You also have the dimension of the Scotch Irish, which make up the sort of Appalachian belt and kind of further going on, which have like a different kind of conception of that. And then,
there's still a connection between, there's still a connection, or there was like for a long time, a connection between Ulster Protestants in the North and those and their like ethnic counterparts, I guess, in America, where, Ian Paisley was going and giving sermons and things, and there was like a lot of like ethnic solidarity there.
Yeah, I mean, and like, people made the comment, sort of like the hill people, the kind of warring nature of that, the sort of anti-authority aspect that represents both cultures across time and place. So that's certainly the case. But I would question you, what do you think, what sect of Christianity or religion has the highest percentage of conventional English Americans?
I would guess that it's, what is it called? I've actually forgotten. The one that people, I can't remember what it's called. The one that people always say is the most similar aesthetically to Catholicism. It's like slightly tea drinking kind of.
Yeah, I've heard it's just, I think Presbyterianism, like I've heard it described as like bells and smells of Catholicism.
Yeah. Is that it?
Well, I know whatever Tucker Carlson is, that's what it is.
Yeah, that's the one. That's the one I'm trying to think of.
Yeah. Whatever that is. Episcopalian,
that's it. Yeah. That one. Is that the correct answer?
No, unfortunately. Close. It's Mormons.
Oh, wow.
Mormons are the most like uniform English composition of a religion in America. And it's pretty odd to like think of it that way, but
that is very odd.
Yeah, but I mean, they're basically this stock of people that existed in upstate New York that kind of traveled through, getting kicked out of every single locale on the way to Utah, and then set up shop in no man's land, and that's where they've existed ever since in their own kind of proto state over there.
Wow. Interesting.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting dynamic when you unpack, what really is American identity, what really is, the ethnic histories that fuel real debates and real interest groups, and those interests are sometimes not in alignment with one another. And so I guess to maybe return to like the Irish subject, I think like the point of the matter here is when it comes to immigration is like, no one would say, hey, you're hemorrhaging blood. That's just how it is. If you're hemorrhaging your people, there's something going wrong, no matter what rhetoric you're using to sort of justify, oh, well, we just can't sustain that level of people.
Yeah, no, that's a huge problem, and they're remarkably, and the whole kind of the whole set of ideas about almost like a way of life that came in with all these ideas in the 90s, which was cosmopolitan in the sense that you should not be rooted in any particular place and you can just move around, and that this is a good and enlightened way to be. That is, that's kind of almost justified all of this, because it does teach people, like, it's actually a good thing that you don't own any property, and it's actually a good thing that you had to leave, basically. And also, they're just educating too many people, like, because the other thing was everything. Okay, the one of the ideas that they absorbed in the 90s was like the new economy and like the knowledge economy, and basically that we don't need to have like big national industries or anything like that. We can just have, everyone can be sort of a knowledge economy worker in some way. And so they just sent everyone to college. Like, I had free college, for example. And, we know that like educating way too many people is down the line a really destabilizing force in society. Especially if you don't actually have jobs for those people to go to. So there is this whole generation, like my generation, whose parents didn't finish school, but who ended up with, you just totally overeducated with PhDs and things like that, but no economic prospects. And so, that's also a model that I don't know how they're going to wean themselves off of, right? Because they've sort of absorbed this idea and taught an entire generation that these are good values. This is the future. This is the way people should live, and they have changed society's values in that way so that the old expectations that the good life was, leisure time and owning your own home and things like that, that's all changed now. And so there will have to be, in some ways, for a real change to happen in the economy, there will also have to come with that kind of a cultural revolution as well, like another one where you have to kind of reverse those values to some degree, but maybe that will happen on its own, because I think people are already aware. I see people right and left, kind of showing a lot of awareness of this isn't actually working out very well, and that it was a very, very good way of selling something that was actually just a degrading of people's standard of living.
Yeah, and I think who's a great writer on this stuff is Connor McCabe, and
Yeah.
I just imagine him like at every new finding he has, he's just constantly going like WTF.
Yeah,
Because he does a great job of doing this connection to the colonial mindset of what was desired for Ireland back then, and like how it's just sort of, casually maintained into the independent era. And, one of the things that was prioritized by the English was like, hey, we don't want the Irish on the land. It'd be great if we could do fewer of them. So like the idea that it's a part of Irish manifest destiny to leave Ireland is just sort of baffling when you
not own any land. I know, it's absolutely amazing irony of history.
Not own any land. That's another great point.
Yeah. Sometimes I think that one of the big, back in 2016, when everyone sort of that I knew was talking about, was having this argument about like essentially egalitarian economics, if you like different visions of how to achieve something like a more just economic system. And there was this idea that sort of populism was this meaningless term that had no real set of ideas behind it and stuff like that. A lot of people on the more socialist left would make that charge, But I think one of the big differences, if you look at the history of populism, is actually land. It's an attitude to land, because so like even a figure like Huey Long, for example, like what he wanted to give to people was their own plot. It was like a Caesar even would be like another example. Like the populace has always been about sort of giving people their own little plot of land, giving people their own economic independence. And so there is this kind of, in a way, this is kind of like almost dekulakization like effect, isn't there? Like where there's like this huge consolidation of power among a few big monopoly corporations. Sorry, and yeah, people are just being made landless, basically, or and that's a really interesting, way of thinking of like, even if you look at something like The Field, um, to a kind of 90s bugman, like the feel like the mind of such a character is like inconceivable, because just the value systems are completely different.
Yeah, and this is where I believe like you're writing right now about Ray Crotty, and so much of his material is centered around land and specifically like agriculture too. And so like the idea that we've moved towards this idea, well, we don't need to have that lifestyle, or like no one ever has to consider that equation again. You can just be your bug self existing in your your bug pod in a bug city, where you don't own anything and you produce knowledge and you produce, well, maybe that's too much of a benefit of the doubt there, but
yeah, you're contributing to the sum of human knowledge over at BuzzFeed or whatever.
Or to reference another piece that you more recently wrote, you're a cleric. You're servicing the cleric class, and you're sustaining that sort of inequality.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing that would be great, in terms of thing we were talking about earlier, the diaspora and stuff like that, is it would be great to get lots of people like you just like trying to solve these problems and trying to think about, like, I love that idea. I mean, I never expected to hear this from David McWilliams, but that idea that had amazingly never really occurred to me, that, because there's this discussion going on about outward and inward migration, but we have this huge diaspora population to draw upon, and, all of the different kinds of experience and ideas and kind of imagination that will bring, that's like such a huge that's such a huge benefit to have, if we do find a way to move out of the current like deadlock that Ireland has been in for a while economically,
Yeah, and not to maybe like get into like controversial subjects or anything like that, but to like put a finer point on like what is McWilliams really kind of getting at. And to his own writing, he admits this, basically advocating Irish Zionism. And so and reading his stuff, I mean, he is almost as mainstream as it gets, but he has just an interesting quirk to him where he says things like this here and there.
That is a funny thing. I think sometimes I find that I disagree with him like most of the time, but yeah, it is true. And sometimes I think he also says things where I'm not entirely sure if he realizes how controversial they are or could be, Like for example, after the riot in the Capitol, or whatever you want to call it, January 6th, he wrote this thing saying like, well, you know, the people who are there are basically just like not good genetic stock, and they're like left behind by economics, so they're probably just going to be left behind by history, and that sucks for them. Like that was pretty much how he said it, which
Yeah.
was so funny because that's what American liberals think too, but they would never say it like that.
Well, you know, that's another reason too why I kind of like I desired to kind of do my master's degree in Ireland. You know, I kind of looked around America, and you know, I was going more into humanities more so than just sort of the quant economics because of my trajectory. So I looked around. I said, well, I don't know if I'll be able to do exactly what I want to do, and I thought looking, because I've been to Ireland before and I kind of knew a bit of the culture. I talked to some people, some professors. There seemed to be a more like down to earth, like you could at least talk about some objectivity, or
Yeah.
There was not this sort of veil that we existed in America, that, you know, there's still this level of you can talk to someone sort of directly.
Yeah, that is absolutely true. And you know, I also think I tell my friends like at home, like appreciate because God, I mean, it might change, and I really, really hope it doesn't, but they should appreciate what they have, which is like, you know, for example, one thing that's very shocking in America is the way in which the media has been used to just basically terrorize the public.
Mm.
You know, and so everyone just lives in fear at all times, and it's, you know, it's not like the state, it's not like the Stasi, it's not like the state coming to your, although sometimes that is also happening, right? The FBI are actually going around and just like arresting people, sometimes the wrong people. I read an article recently where they got the wrong people and they just crashed into this family's house in the middle of the night and dragged them out. But even like the terrorizing that the media does, which is very powerful, you know, it means that anyone who gets targeted by them, you know, you lose your reputation, which matters enormously to people. It's like the first, like, you know, Othello, it's like the first kind of, you know, basic observation about people, you know, and but also you lose your job and everything. And it can often, in many cases, be for things that actually most people know privately are, you know, it is like a totally deliberate bad faith interpretation of what is being said, you know. And so that's just everywhere now. And in Ireland, that's not the case. People are not terrorized by the media. Like, people can complain about RT and the Irish Times. They have their bias. The bias is obvious though, right? Like, he's not around anymore, but like Kevin Myers used to be one of the big columnists in Ireland, right? Kevin Myers was like a revisionist kind of figure. He wasn't crazy about Irish nationalism. He kind of but you know, he was a very stylish writer, and he was interesting, but you know what his bias is, right? So it's like very simple to read and interpret that. Whereas you know, and so in Ireland there's basically still a kind of general level of politeness and acceptable moral behavior when it comes to these institutions. Like, you cannot just, if a journalist just went to an average citizen who said something that was not politically correct and went and, you know, if the government like crashed through their windows, or if the media went and, you know, wrote like published a horrible picture of them, and, you know, got off the record quotes from all their colleagues saying horrible things about them, the kind of really, really, really vicious like type of journalism you see in America, that would not be morally acceptable. Like, people just wouldn't accept it, you know. And so, and also, I guess in America, like since the Cold War, there's been this rolling out, and God knows how big and dark it's gotten since then on the inside, but there's been this like rolling out of just like a blank check was written for like experimental psychology and stuff like that within the security state. And so everyone's kind of a bit crazy now, as a result, because there's probably even warring factions who are doing different psychological operations that are clashing with each other, and nobody knows, like everyone's like Alex Jones now, nobody really knows what is real. And all those basic sort of, I guess, like a level below which you thought it would not go, like that's just disappeared now. So basically the government can just do anything, the media can do anything. There's no moral limits at all on any of this, and that's very shocking. So I definitely think if anyone has the same idea you had, it's worth it, like, going and studying in a place like Ireland, because it's not great. We still do have some of the same things, but it's not seeped into every level of society. And you can, as you say, still have a normal conversation with people that does not feel like you're living in the last days of the Soviet Union,
Yeah. And, I'm sure there's all sorts of reasons why that's the case, but I think one of those, and again, like why Ireland represents such an interesting subject to me, who's an outsider, is that, it has the colonial history. So there's a level of like bullshit detection that just the Irish people have naturally. And I think going back to like the ultimate origin of, like Crotty calls it, individualist capitalism, or liberalism, like all these ideas that are just, shooting out into everything in modernity. Like so much of that, we can say Europe, Enlightenment, wherever else, don't be so Eurocentric or whatever. But like so much it actually was developed and propagandized from England and the United Kingdom. And Ireland represents this like original contradiction to everything that we're kind of dealing with. Because if those same people were making these arguments about free market, about, liberating, yourself from the collectivism, and in terms of everything that comes from the psychology of that to sort of the more materialist aspects of that, they're doing that with their backs turned to a country that is totally being subjugated. And so that's where like trying to just untangle that lineage of liberal thinkers and how they were right next to this contradiction and never really trying to figure out. I think Richard Cobden is with the quote where he said, it's hard to solve Irish problems by English means.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting, like very broad thesis, actually. Yeah, and I also think too, you can even see things like, the way in which like none of the political categories that are common in, I guess, the English influenced world even really apply in Ireland. I mean, there isn't really a left and right party, for example. Well, it's a French thing, but there isn't really a left and right party. There, our most famous, or I guess like the closest thing we have to like a right wing commentator or something would be like John Waters, who was like, like a rock music journalist in the 60s and 70s, I guess, or maybe into the 80s, and who loves like all the like third world, like post-colonial writers and stuff like that. You know what I mean? Just like it's totally different. Like there's no real equivalent elsewhere. And that also, I mean, but one great thing too is that there is kind of still a living tradition there to draw upon as well. A lot of the time, yeah, I mean, it's so recent, the fact that it's so recent is an opportunity, because it's such a brilliant but unfulfilled revolution, which, as you say, was like the economic revolution never happened. but also there's a tragedy about it too, which is that this amazing miracle happened, and then like right afterwards, everyone fell out of love with nationalism, right? Like the general like way of, you know, Europe or whatever of the world like moved against nationalism in some way. And we don't know where that's going. Like if that, you know, there are people who believe that this is the end of nations, basically, that they're just going to become less and less powerful and relevant, and that globalization will just keep going. But I don't know if you have any theories on that, or if you think that's wrong.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the question, and in a way too, I mean, it represents, there's an ongoing debate, and my degree is in global history, and a lot of the discussion centers around, what is Eurocentrism. But I think like where there can be malformations of that idea, I think like in a way, like the idea that globalism is going on uninhibited or without alternative is somewhat of like a Eurocentric context. And it's like,
yeah.
When we go out to like East Asia, which is my kind of favorite parallel to look, especially towards Ireland, they embrace some sort of, palatable form of nationalism vis-a-vis the global system. And that's where you look at a country like South Korea, practically the same size as Ireland, similar resource potential. At the time, especially when it was not developed yet, similar population. And yet South Korea is one of the most developed, industrialized manufacturing powers in the world. And on the same land mass as equivalent to Ireland, has about 60 million people on it, where Ireland still has about 5 to 6 million. So, within this globalizing world, and certainly South Korea and the other East Asian giants are sort of part of that globalized world, they found a loophole where they basically prioritized their domestic population. They said, we're going to provide jobs, we're going to provide productivity enhancing jobs, so that we're constantly iterating up and you're getting wealthier as a result. And basically that argument of national globalism is Frederick List. Everything about Frederick List in a way was conducive to liberal ideology in some sense, because his ultimate goal was, once everyone protects their economy enough and develops to an equal status, we can kind of do away with all of this, and we can have this free trade of global partners. But before that, we can still have kind of globalized trade, but it has to be this, very demarcated, planned relationship between nations that are working towards equalizing development. So he never, and this is where Griffith too, it wasn't like and this is the core contrast between De Valera and like Griffith. It was not, let's box Ireland into frugal comfort. Let's isolate it into these, small fairy tale like farmsteads. Griffith was very much like, we have to export to the world. We need to have our goods in every continent. He talked about Argentina, Japan, like every country in the world. He wanted to export Irish goods. He wanted to set up consulars. There was very much a global aspect to that, which again, South Korea, Japan, all these countries basically did. So that's where there's a way to embrace kind of just maybe the globalized nature of the information economy, of levels of trade and levels of immigration that go on, but in a way that is still conducive to, again, what Frederick List emphasizes, that there is this thing of a nation, and both the left and the right are not acknowledging that the nation kind of exists as this community with a single interest in mind, which is the benefit of their community at, not the expense, but, in isolation from others in a sense.
Yeah, and I think there is such, because of the diaspora as well, I guess, I mean, there is such potential for export coming from Ireland, you know, like an export economy. There even are already, like I notice when I go abroad, there are so many kind of national brands that are everywhere, you know, and that like just like butter and things like that, you know, and or like Waterford Crystal.
That has like though a little bit of a bite to it, doesn't it? When you think about the McCabe cattle grazing,
yeah,
into it.
yeah. You know, there's one other we were talking about. Raymond Crotty, who's this like farmer economist, and you know wrote about colonial underdevelopment and things like that. Conor McCabe then adds a lot to that, but I think also there's one more person worth reading, which is Michael Taft, who's a trade union economist, and he wrote a piece called, let me see if I can find it. He's basically, he's tried to make the case for how and why Ireland should sort of embrace kind of like an indigenous productive economy that is for export.
Yeah, which is totally in line with what you could see as a specific ideology, you know, derived from Frederick List, but again, as sort of the fundamentals of objective development policy. Of you can't do it through FDI or import substitution. And there's a great book by Kenichi Ono about it's called The History of Japanese Economic Development. And he does it, and he comes from Stanford, so you can maybe identify where he has a foundation, where he's coming from. But he's basically analyzing, you know, how did this happen? How did the Japanese go from, you know, gunship diplomacy with America to being a superpower in their own right? And one of the things the Japanese really concentrated on was, we're going to be very careful about import substitution. We're going to let foreigners in. They can set up some firms. We're going to have a very strict, you know, ownership dynamic. You know, after a certain period of time, once we have enough employed, once we get some of our brainiacs in there that can kind of figure out what's going on, we're going to basically help them set up a competing shop, and we're going to basically obsolete out the foreign company that was in the country, or even just hire foreigners on a contract basis to go into the domestic companies or the state-owned enterprises, and just be that knowledge facilitator up into the degree where you can take the training wheels off. And so this is just sort of the core fundamentals, because if you let this import substitution come in, or even worse, you let economists come in and tell you, you know, what your comparative advantage is. You know, you end up getting into basically this stagnation of resource extraction, of agricultural extraction, and you never embrace industrialization. Or again, and another writer that's very good about this is Eric S. Reinert, where he talks about how it's really about what is increasing returns to scale, what is productivity enhancing. So it's not exactly just, you know, we need smokestacks and big machines. It's really just, you know, what are we putting less cost into that is giving us more and more in returns over time.
Yeah.
And Reinhardt is actually another great person to have this conception of, you know, what's going on with the left and the right, where they kind of have a lot of similarities. And his whole take on the matter is, they're both branches of Ricardian economics. Of their, you know, Karl Marx, Adams, like everybody that came after in terms of the more liberal tradition, they all basically share this shared intellectual history that they generate out of, and that's why there's so many similarities when you kind of identify them. And Reinhardt, and really coming from a position where he backs Frederick List and the wider German historical school of economics that became outdated, but was a real contender in the early 19th century, mid 19th century with England, that there's an other canon, as he describes it, of how we can trace how you do economics. what are the assumptions we're making? What are these ideological frames we're putting around ourselves? And so that's where you suddenly open yourself up to where, you don't need to enter into this camp of, right-wing Milton Friedmanism or left-wing, kind of neo-Marxianism or whatever. There's these other alternatives. And to lend it back to you, I think you kind of hit this so well when you wrote in your 2015 book about austerity under Ireland, or Ireland under austerity. You start identifying, why is the left reaction to the capitalist austerity measures and crisis parallel to what the capitalists want?
Yeah, honestly, it's so long ago since I wrote that. I'm not sure what I said. Can you remind me?
You basically said that there was this embracement by the left of sort of the deindustrialized space,
oh, yes,
media, tech-utopianism, that all just conducively fit into granting carte blanche to the political establishment that they would characterize as these evil capitalists. That's everything they wanted. They wanted tech-utopianism. They wanted a post-industrial society. And somehow they're both converging. The opposition to that is somehow the same. And you do a great job in that chapter.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's always like, it is true that one of my big sort of realizations that changed my political views in some ways was that basically that Marx is perfectly within that tradition, and there's really just like a little detail at the end that changes the narrative, if you know what I mean. So just the fact that you arrive at communism through this process is just the totally left wide open detail at the end of the telos, kind of, right, that like we don't have any reason to think will ever actually occur. And so basically what you have is just that same school of liberal economics, with this little twist at the end. And any attempt to direct that even is some kind of form of reaction, like against this kind of, that moves against this stream of history. But as you were saying before, I think before we started recording, in the Soviet Union, like they couldn't draw on Marx when it actually came to having to transform this like peasant society into like, one of this big industrial powerhouse that was able to rival America and everything. They had to draw on List, or a kind of version of List. Oh,
yeah, and a great encapsulation of really viewing Marx versus List is in Roman Spurluck's Communism and Nationalism, Karl Marx versus Frederick List. And there is this dynamic where List is critiquing capitalism. He's critiquing liberalism. And there's a lot of overlap between the criticism Marx makes. And this is where, the uniqueness of Marx is put into question of, was Marx part of a milieu that was identifying this, which was the German Historical School of Economics, which he was brought up in. A funny story of history is that because of illness, Frederick List dealt with I think stomach problems or something all his life. Because he just had a very bad bout of it in his earlier days, he turned down this editorship of a newspaper in Germany. And who do you think gets the position in his place? Karl Marx. Yeah. And it's this funny quirk of history where, Marx would have gone to do whatever Marx would have done, but there's this level of, direct interplay where they're right next to each other, and they're feeding off one another. And in many ways, Marx is responding to List in certain respects, and there's a few letters, like if you go through, where Marx directly comments on, List as basically, this all manner of bad words because he's embracing the backwardness of nationalism, but yeah, that's where all this stuff comes together, and it's very interesting to see why this conception of a critique of capitalism, of liberalism, necessitates us to go into a totalitarian version of Marxism, which, you don't have to agree with the guy. You can agree with some of the stuff. He made good points. He made bad. It's like, this is where it's like he's a human, yet he has this thing. Once you're a critic, you become this leftist where you can't think outside of this Marxist box. And you can't go to a guy where, like List, where he's making so much of the same criticism. So much of the criticism also were being made by the Germans as a competing academic school. And to that degree, to go even further back, like List had a sojourn in America at the time when America was trying to outcompete England, and there were guys over there. People always say Hamilton is the guy that basically was all about nationalist economics, protectionism, this and that. I have my own view where I don't know if he was that seminal in spelling all this out, but where List emphasizes is that, of all people too, an Irish Catholic, a father-son duo, Henry Carey and his junior, basically inspired him in a big way of like how they were writing about American economics and how they saw the need to protect themselves against the comparative advantages of England, and how that then went on to inspire List. So all of these traditions exist that are critiquing what Marxists think they're the only ones with the critique to. And
yeah. Yeah, it's terrible because I hope now we're probably about 2 hours into this or something. So I hope none of my enemies will have gotten this far. But I really do increasingly think, and I would have to really go and like make this a huge years-long project, like a book or something like that. But I do increasingly think that when you look at how many great ideas were around at the time and got attacked and then buried by Marxism, I really think like anyone who's like a young person who, can just see like, doesn't like economic inequality or something like that, right? They don't know, they don't understand anything about economics or anything like that, but they're just young and they have this good, actually, what is fundamentally a moral impulse. I mean, again, like the ideology of Marxism will say, no, this is all science. It's got nothing to do with morals, but that's just not true, because that's not, you're not inclined to spend all of your free time and like devote your life to something if it's just, if there isn't some kind of a moral impulse behind it. So I think all young people that have that tendency just immediately get hoovered up into Marxism, right? And it basically just wastes decades of their life, intellectually and emotionally and whatever, the best years of the most productive years of their life, on this like really rigid ideology, which I increasingly feel may have actually been just a deliberately invented, totally malicious. I actually think Marx was like a malicious, devious person who deliberately tried to subvert all these brilliant ideas taking place around him. Do you know what I mean?
Hey, you're kind of speaking to the choir here. Which is, it's hard to sometimes attribute motive and core intentions, but yeah, I mean, the guy quoted as saying, I want the acceleration of free trade because that will bring on, the eventual capitalist collapse and thus communism. So much of his personal background is that as a bourgeois capitalist. It's very hard to think that there wasn't something else maybe going on. I will say that I do find enlightening kind of looking at some of the discourse between him and then what became of in the late 19th century, sort of the anarchist movement, and like seeing as that the anarchists were sort of going against what he really was talking about. We're kind of creating their own version. As I say a lot of times, like history is a sequence of creators of ideas going, hey, here's what I think. And then someone runs with it in a complete different direction. They go, wait, that's wrong. And they never get vindicated.
Yeah.
So there's a sense where the anarchists kind of did that to Marxism and kind of co-opted it. But I think there's a level of, there's certainly a level, whether it was intentional or again, and this is the problem of ideology, you can't think outside of the frames that you're kind of locked in if you're taking certain assumptions. And if that's where Marx is kind of coming from, sort of this position where like certainly he had a lot of German influence, but he's also getting this sort of English school influence. And he's trying to synthesize that. I think I'm probably more in terms of probabilities, like the ideology that he employed probably misled him and that misled everybody else.
Yeah.
But certainly, hey, there could be maliciousness to it.
Yeah, I mean, even in the fact that like the way that he wrote about other people was so malicious, like he was so and I'm fine with like a certain amount of like a level of discussion among intellectuals that isn't totally polite and genteel. Like I get it. I'm not like I don't think that you should just be polite all the time. And some of that, like I guess banter or whatever you want to call it, is fun and is actually quite funny. But there was a kind of definitely an extraordinary mean streak in so much of how. But he particularly targeted his rivals for that space, like even LaSalle and figures like that, he really just with a total vengeance, like went after these figures who had, frankly, a vision of the potential direction of where all this is going that I think would have probably worked out much better historically had he not intervened in the way that he did. And it's also just like it I also think that there's a charisma to his. I've often thought that there's a charisma to people who are very, very discerning in their moral judgments of people, of others. And so if a person is, adores and showers love on their allies and eviscerates their opponents, people are very drawn to that psychologically. You know what I mean? That it has a certain kind of a charismatic draw for people, and he's sort of one of those figures. And I even notice now, like in the aftermath of the failure of left-wing populism, the whole Bernie and Corbyn and all that stuff, many of my leftist friends are sort of scrambling around trying to make sense of what's going on and trying to, they're seeing that all these things like were so disastrous. And I think what's troubling them is the fact that they've been given this dogma that says that the worst thing the worst thing in the world is to be a utopian, an idealist, or a reactionary. Like that, they're getting that language directly from him. And specifically the way that they employ it against, like reformers and social democrats and different kinds of people in this very contemptuous way. I think that they did learn that from him. That's like one of the stylistic things that he's sort of given to the left that's very bad. And so they're just not able to think their way out of this problem because, they say like, well, the problem with is the reason it all went wrong is because it was too reformist or something like that. It wasn't radical enough, right? And or they might say something like, they employ these terms like reactionary and to those they perceive as their opponents. But what I always say to them is like, you know, all of these things that we're seeing, this is like all this like crazy cultural stuff that is like disturbing everyone. That's like that's all that a solid melts into air, right? That's the progress that Marx thought was good. So the fact that you have some discomfort about this means that you are reactionary according to your own ideology, which then they can't accept. So then they have like a crisis, you know, like a psychological crisis, you know. And so in so many ways, I just feel like, yeah, Marxism's just done an enormous amount of damage, and it makes people, honestly, at a certain point, people just who get so lost in it, they are not able to ever think their way out of the problem because they keep doubling down on the same mistake, you know?
Yeah, yeah. And I find a lot of leftist writers, they make good observations. Like you can read a lot of them. Like I really like Slobodian, makes good observations about history, about economics. It is just like when you get, even if they're not like primarily Marxist or whatever, they're sort of adjacent, you get lost in this sort of turgid circling of the drain, trying to find the answer when, like you're saying, you're sort of locked into this and you have this psychological crisis of like inability to really come to the solution, where if you allow yourself to break out of that, and I think certainly a guy like Hanju Chang, deriving from like Cambridge, and you know, you could imagine what influence he might have had, and what people characterize him as sort of like a leftist and this and that. But he, again, he is primarily coming from the inspiration of Frederick List. And, you know, he kind of looks around at all these sort of Marxist ideas. And I think he really says, you know, people are sort of starving and like living in subsistence agriculture, and like, we're going to fix that. Like, we're going to fix this problem immediately. We're through clear cut. And again, you could say materialistic, industrial policies, where so much of like left-wing discussion when it comes to kind of third world development is sort of counter to that. It's almost like, oh, you can't become capitalist. You can't go down, you know, the capitalist path. You need to leapfrog, or you need to try to avoid that. Yeah. And that's where I find, whether it's Chang or, you know, I look at like Griffith and Collins in a similar way, and all the way back to List, they're all looking at their undeveloped economies and nations and saying, you know, there's a clear way to move forward and like help people. And, you know, there's this other group of people that are coming in and basically coming up with all these theories and ideologies that are basically losing us in their own minds. And they're distracting us away from what is a question of, you know, maybe we can deal with that contradiction in the future, but it's sort of like this thing of, you know, are we going to like gamble with still being a subjugated power that's weak and doesn't have its own economy and thus ability to orchestrate power politics against those that are, you know, trying to subjugate us, or, you know, like, or actually do that, and then we'll deal with the problem once we have the power. Yeah, and you know, and another great example of where this went on was how the Russian Revolution actually developed. And up until 1917, there was, within the, you know, that 17 years in the 20th century, other like populist revolutionary episodes that came to the floor. And so like when you get into sort of the 1905, 1906, 1907 kind of revolutionary moments that didn't ultimately succeed in the fullest concept of it, what you end up finding is that the Marxist, the communist, were this sort of floating above it all, unattached group towards what the mainstream revolution was, of like the general strike. And what you end up finding is that the communists were against the general strikes.
Yeah.
And like that's such of a baffling idea to think, but this is where they were at. And so you can actually start to see the crux of, you know, romanticism when it comes to how do you bring Marxism into the world, which is Russia, you start to pick that apart and you actually see, oh, there's actually like a nationalist populist, and all the baggage those terms might contain. The point of the matter is it was a wide swath of mainstream society going against, what they saw as unjust power and elite establishment. And the communist represented a faction that articulated opposition to that movement. And only because it was so clear it wasn't going away and it was taking over, did they then finally come around and start to attach themselves to it. Yeah, I know that was a lot.
I have nothing to add.
Yeah. But yeah, it's an incredible way that we kind of arrive at our conceptions of economics, where we're locked in to all these things.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't want to hold up too much of your time. I know we've been going on. If I could just maybe end on something that's a little bit more familiar to me too, and I think relates to your other chapter, is this idea of sort of tech-utopianism, and where I see coming into the floor, like how everyone's starting to embrace Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies on this level. And there's an amazing prescience that you were able to articulate in that article of finding the intellectual histories of how these things come together, and how we're just walking into this new way of viewing the world through decentralized money, and ultimately going further back, not like forget about money. It's the principles of open source software, of decentralized technology, everything that comes to that, where you look at sort of guys like Richard Stallman, look at guys like Perry Barlow, like these sort of like people from the 80s and 90s that stipulated all this, and has created both a left wing and a right wing conception of what decentralized tech is. So I don't know if you could maybe what are your insights on this sort of crypto phenomenon? Because then it also relates back to your Kill All Normies book of like these internet subgroups.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the time that I was writing that was like a very, very fashionable idea. I think actually maybe after the book, after Kill All Normies, because so for years before then, right, what people, libertarians and all kinds of different factions, mainly leftists, were saying was like that a new style of politics would emerge with like Occupy Wall Street and the Arab Spring and stuff like that, that would be a kind of emancipatory, decentralized online form of politics, where like a protest could just pop up like immediately, and politics could be accelerated in some way and happen very fast. And it was really utopian and really positive, and there was all kinds of what was his name, that Marxist in Britain wrote a book called Why It's Kicking Off Everywhere. Yeah, and so it was like really utopian. I mean, it's amazing to think about it now. But then what happened was basically in 2016, it became obvious that, in fact, the right were going to really capture this like opportunity, and that, in fact, movements of the right were going to utilize all these tools in a much more clever way, and in a way that it was never expected, because the left had only ever encountered the right as something stodgy, something old, looking to the past and so on. And then like they were totally blindsided by this massive entire like culture basically that emerged from the internet that was right wing. And so then they basically changed their narrative after that. It's never been the same since. Now it's all, once that happened, the new narrative is the internet is dangerous. We have to restrict freedom of speech. And all the stuff, all the utopian stuff they were saying about human emancipation is completely gone. so that is the big change that happened. And so that book, both Kill All Normies and a chapter that I wrote for a book I edited about Irish economics, which you're referencing, were both written in the context where the utopianism was dominant. And so I wonder sometimes if, like, even the way I was critiquing it wouldn't even make sense to somebody reading it now, sort of out of context. But so, yeah, I mean, I guess that's the new context right now, where everything is sort of seen through that lens, and there's much more establishment fear of the internet and the potential for chaos kind of that it brings and stuff like that. I mean, I'm seeing lately, I was much more skeptical of those things back then, but I think now, like, even something like we're both on Substack, right? But if you look at something like Substack as a model, so the media for years is being discredited, right? And people are losing trust in it and stuff like that. The Substack model allowed, I mean, it is a winner takes all thing, right? Undoubtedly, it created a few big celebrities and they just became probably millionaires from it. But the good side is that it's been able to draw all the best people away from institutions that they probably hate being in. And that they're forced to abide by all kinds of unfair rules and restrictions and speech restrictions and stuff like that within them. It gives them an economic incentive to leave the institutions, which is going to accelerate the decline of those institutions, which is great. And it also then gives those interesting people freedom, and which is going to, you know, which is going to kind of generate new ideas and things like that. And because in many cases they spent years like frustrated in these institutions, they're using their new platforms to just throw bombs back at the institution that they left. And so I think that that's like an example of a way that sometimes these, you know, these forces like can actually accelerate things in a good direction, you know. I mean, I think, for example, academia, maybe in some countries it's not like this, but I think the way academia is in America, for example, I think it will need to have something like that happen, where there's just a total exit of people who are just independent-minded or intellectually curious, like, from the institutions, so that they become so completely indefensible and rotten that, you know, then it just becomes an economic question of getting rid of them.
Yeah, I think, though, your point going back to the 2015 book is that there's this unconscious embracement of these sort of decentralized alternatives and like opposition, that there's this box you can go into if you're an oppositional figure to whatever mainstream clerical society is in your country. I think the interesting thing is just looking at it is like, well, what is the box we're being sent into? And that's where I think when you start to look under the hood of a lot of these sort of decentralized technologies, you start to see there's some contradictions going on in terms of how decentralized are they, of who's operating them, who's in sort of monopoly control. You know, what else are they doing? You know, who is the godfather of Silicon Valley and how is he deriving a lot of income right now? You know, you could extrapolate further. And I think, and that's where it's like, I'm dealing with these things right now when it comes to thinking about tech and how there's sort of a false consciousness going on with it.
Yeah, no, that is definitely true also. Yeah, I mean, that's why I think, like, it is always good to be skeptical of these things. And I also think that those kind of, when there are positive disruptive forces, it's only temporary, and it will also just be re-centralized in its own way, you know. sometimes to maybe even a greater degree than before.
Yeah, and that's where.
But yeah, but what do you think? I mean, because in terms of Bitcoin, I assume that that you think that Bitcoin has some kind of positive potential, right?
Yeah, so I mean, I got into it because I went through the what you could imagine is the logical libertarian phase of young people developing in America. And I just saw Bitcoin as this attractive, you know, counter state. A term agorism is thrown around as this sort of like you operate as if there is not a state, and you kind of don't use political channels to sort of get your freedom. So it was very attractive in that sense that it had this ability to subvert oppressive power, and there was this ability to transact without censorship, and that's where I viewed as like the primary use case. As I became more involved and understood what it was, the theory behind it, the economics behind it, the technology behind it, and also there's this thing going on where decentralized community, like there's no person that owns it. It's like out there, it's ethereal. It's like it's the same thing as saying like, well, the free market. It's like, no, there's no one, there's always some good guy that can come in to rectify an evil monopolist or this or that corrupt individual. And I started to see there's these similarities. And going deeper, it's like, no, there are kind of monopolistic control of certain things and bottlenecks, and there's a lot more propaganda going on and what the people saying that actually believe and do. So I saw this and actually kind of came out the other side as this huge skeptic. And, kind of in a weird way, I went all the way to the extreme of like anarchist libertarian money. And now I'm more preferential to MMT varieties. Yeah. So, I mean, so that's where, you look at the recent case study going on right now that El Salvador just basically embraced Bitcoin as its legal tender. And they're trying to just totally encapsulate their economy in it. And this is where I like using the phrase, it's neoliberalism. First it was the Milton Friedmanites coming in to talk about, how you liberalize your economy and use the dollar. And now it's these Bitcoiners that it's like, oh yeah, we're the alternative. Here, use this other foreign currency that's global, you don't have any control over. And that you still have to do all those liberalizing and privatization schemes. So it's just the same thing. And that's where, again, you're being directed into a box that's set up by people that maybe, they represent an opposition, but is their opposition like, hey, we're the new kids on the block and the elites, and, we kind of want to take over, this sort of Silicon Valley versus the sort of New York, Washington, D.C. nexus. And they're saying, we're not going to like change the dynamic up really. We want to be at the driver's seat. So that's sort of how I view crypto, Bitcoin emerging as this neoliberalism.
Yeah, that's really interesting. No, it's true. I mean, I think one of the things I was saying in that piece was like, again, because those ideas were very fashionable on the left at the time, and as I say, that's changed for the reasons I already said. I think that like it became very easy for economic agendas that were already in place to be repackaged in a liberatory way that was appealing to, I suppose, libertarians and also just kind of leftists in a vague, broad sense. For the example being something like the Arab Spring, right? The idea that like social media is going to liberate everyone and make everyone more politically emancipated and more politically active and so on. Well, like, look at now, it's a total nightmare. Like, we're all living in a dystopian nightmare because everyone has been too politicized by the internet. And it's actually become the most totally conformist, brutal, just like display of power ever.
Yeah, somehow when it was the Arab Spring in concert with the Washington Consensus, the
Yeah.
technological revolution of social media was good. And now, when there's the equivalent Arab Springs in the West, there's something wrong about that.
Yeah,
Something going
exactly.
on there. Yeah, I mean, this stuff is incredible. But too, like you're saying, like there's this leftist thing too there. And now that I'm submerged in the MMT discourse, I've discovered they're not immune to some of this thinking. And if you
Mm,
follow a guy named Rohan Gray, he actually
mm,
just spoke in front of one of these U.S. congressional hearings about what to go forward with central bank digital currency. And he exists within this sort of tent of the MMTers of like Kelton and yada, yada, yada. You go down the list of, who's embracing this stuff. And he's talking about his preferred design of like how you set up the new kind of currency technology as like the mainstay of how we use money going forward.
mm,
You need to not do it in a centralized fashion where the government's in control, but you need to do it in a way that is open source, is decentralized tech, and it's basically crypto, but with this leftist veneer on it. He'll probably, if you were ever to hear this, he'd go nuts that I'm saying this.
mm,
But this is the point of getting at like there's a kernel that both of these things, crypto and this like open source decentralized MMT, are deriving their inspirations. And if we don't have the conversation about what is it about open source decentralized tech that is true and false, we're going to either go in this right wing direction of crypto finance, or we're going to go in this left wing direction of MMT, open source, and it's both going to have the same fundamental contradiction. What exists is like, is it actually decentralized, or are we just putting a curtain between society and the monopolists that control it?
mm. I know that, do you know there's an Italian writer called Thomas Fazi?
Yeah,
Fazi?
I think he's come across my radar. I don't know much.
Yeah, he wrote a book called Reclaiming the State, and he's an MMT person, and he's very good. Everything he writes is brilliant. And there's somebody else I wanted to recommend. Oh, you know what? There's a total asshole called Doug Henwood. And he hates me, and I don't care for him either. But he wrote a very good book in I guess called After the New Economy years ago. It's very dated because it's just a response to its time. But he actually, was very prescient, and his analysis was right, I think. He's unfortunately he had a what would you say, like a 3/4 life crisis, and became really woke as an old person. So it's like a sad thing. But no, he used to write great stuff, and that's a really wonderful book. That's actually was a huge influence on that piece that you referenced that I wrote.
Yeah, I'll have to look into that. I think maybe a way to also tie this all together is like, now we're on MMT, is the fundamental nature of MMT is monetary sovereignty, and
Yeah, yeah.
and it begs the question, which I think a lot of MMTers that are nominally on the left kind of are shying away from, which is what does sovereignty mean? And
Yeah.
they're of course deferential to third worldist narratives, and so they'll placate like nationalist rhetoric when it comes to
Yeah.
that. But the crucial thing about Ireland and its history, and maybe one of the most fundamental aspects of why they did not develop as they should have, is because they did not embrace MMT or
Mm.
monetary sovereignty, in that they continually shoved off the responsibility to maintain their own central bank, their own
Mm.
sovereign currency. They, from the time of the revolution, they pegged it to the British pound. The banks, instead of investing in the domestic economy, they turned all their deposits into either British pounds or British securities, British bonds. And constantly Ireland was going through this problem of not taking on that relationship between the government, the state, and what money is, and the need of the state to actually facilitate long-term investment strategies and different incentive structures using money in order to develop the economy.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's, that's why, as I said to you at the beginning, like I'm not an economist, and I sort of force myself to read some of this stuff, in part because it became so obvious to me after 2008 and seeing all of this stuff in Ireland that the lack of economic sovereignty is absolutely where this is coming from, where all the other problems come from. If you don't have that, then you lose everything else. You lose political, cultural, intellectual sovereignty as well.
Yeah, and it's amazing how socially left Ireland may consider itself as, but the idea, which is even now, it's like mainstream in America, that you would embrace MMT, it seems like such of an inconceivable notion within the, the Irish discourse. But yeah, so I think we've definitely been going on for a little while here. So I want to thank you for coming on. And I know you're writing about Ray Crotty as your next piece in whatever medium that takes form. So if you want to talk about that and any other projects or links that people can check out.
Yeah, I'd say for now, just go to my Substack. That's where I'm putting everything for the moment. I'm trying to kind of make some of those links that we talked about today, going from Crotty to McCabe to all of this like newer stuff that we're talking about, and then trying to link it back to that history that you have been digging into. But that's going to be quite a big piece, so it's probably going to be a couple of months down the line, but before it comes out. But yeah, just go to the Substack. I'm not really on anything else because I hate social media, so everything will be there. And thanks to you too. I was really amazed when I saw the research you were doing, because I've been, as you can see from that piece I wrote years ago, I've kind of had these ideas in my head for a while, and it hasn't really felt like there was an audience there for them, but I think there is now. And I think like you've really connected certain dots in a really interesting way.
Thank you. I hope that I'm able to make a little bit of an impact, as much as
I hope so
feel
too.
the pressure from mainstream academia that I'm currently submerged in right now. Kind of
right, yeah.
That's not the way.
Yeah.
But yeah, so thank you, and thank you so much for coming on. Reading your material was very enlightening for me. Your emphasis on Ray Crotty is like, I've now found my new kind of avatar of like the right way to look at economics. And so thank you for that. And everybody, please go check out all of Angela's materials. They're very good. Kill All Normies, Ireland Under Austerity, and you can find her Substack for further articles.